Has QAnon been selling us a pipe dream? Is Trump fit to lead the United States of America as president? What would George Washington think of Trump? Is the Flynn corruption investigation just a cover to pacify us from what's really going on? And has Trump been ignoring the truth about U.S. involvement in funding and engineering the COVID-19 bioweapon? We'll talk about these issues and more coming up next. You know, I supported the election of Trump, and I continued to support Trump even though he ignored the truth behind the 2017 Las Vegas shootings. Trump said he would protect the Second Amendment, and he hasn't. Quiet as kept. Unconstitutional gun control legislation has been being passed. Most recently, we've seen legislation passed in Virginia and Washington state. In fact, a couple of videos back I mentioned how in Washington state some of the law enforcement officers and sheriffs are refusing to enforce this new unconstitutional gun control legislation. Last year, Congress had 110 gun bills on the table, and it was a very successful year for anti-Second Amendment gun control legislation. The Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019 was passed. We have seen a pattern of FEMA gun control scams related to most of the controversial shootings, and President Trump has turned a blind eye on the FEMA gun control scams and the unconstitutional gun control legislation. Trump hasn't kept his promise to defend the Second Amendment or the people from tyranny. We hear all this stuff from QAnon, but it's been nothing but a pipe dream. The Flynn unmasking investigation isn't enough. That's an intergovernment conflict, but when it comes to injustices committed against the American people, Trump turns a blind eye. He has ignored the truth about U.S. involvement in funding and engineering the COVID-19 bioweapon, and recently said Dr. Fauci is a, quote, very good person, unquote. I played a clip of him saying that in my last video. And in my last video, I also talked about COVID-19 engineering and studies beginning here in the U.S., and then it got transferred to the Wuhan lab, but it started right here in the U.S. And as I said, you can check out my last video to get more information about that. But in this video, we're going to talk about funding that went from the U.S. to the Wuhan lab. Here's an article in Newsweek entitled Dr. Fauci-backed controversial Wuhan lab with U.S. dollars for risky coronavirus research. The article is by Fred Guter. Dr. Anthony Fauci is an advisor to President Donald Trump and something of an American folk hero for his steady, calm leadership during the pandemic crisis, and I'm not sure why it says that. Dr. Fauci has done nothing but exaggerate the severity of this. He has constantly argued to keep everything shut down, and he is definitely playing right into the deep state agenda of crippling our economy. And I think it plays right into this overall plan for this new global cryptocurrency system. And we talked about that more in a previous video, where the vaccine is going to contain a chip, a nanochip, that they're going to use for the cryptocurrency system. The article continues, at least one poll shows that Americans trust Fauci more than Trump on the coronavirus pandemic. And I'm not sure why I read that. Who cares about polls? But just last year, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, the organization led by Dr. Fauci, funded scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other institutions for work on gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses. And I think it's important to mention real quick that it says, and other institutions this funding went to, in other words. So not just the Wuhan lab, and I only mention that because in my previous video we talked about a lot of this funding and stuff and how this started right here in the US. And a lot of that is being ignored right now, and they're focusing on China. But not only did funding go from the US to China, to the Wuhan lab, but this federal funding with taxpayer money this whole thing started right here in the US. And again, you can look at my last video, I talked about that more. Eventually they moved it to the Wuhan lab in China. And I just want to mention briefly, when they're talking about gain of function, here's a little bit of information. Pathogens may be intentionally or unintentionally genetically modified to change their characteristics, including virulence or toxicity. When intentional, these mutations can serve to adapt the pathogen to a laboratory setting, understand the mechanism or transmission or pathogenesis, or in the development of therapeutics. Such mutations have also been used in the development of biological weapons, and dual-use risk continues to be a concern in the research of pathogens. The greatest concern is frequently associated with gain-of-function mutations, which confer novel or increased functionality and the risk of their release. And I only mention that because, again, is the information I just went over was explaining. There's a dual use here. There's research that they say they do to develop therapeutics, and then there's research that really is only meant to create a bioweapon. So anytime they're talking about gain of function research or gain of function, that's when they're talking about something that is really only useful as a bioweapon, because what it does is it creates something that'll get everybody sick, and that's where they're they're diverging away from development for therapeutics or therapy or anything like that, and they're getting into stuff that's just harmful. And as I continue this information, you guys will see what I mean, because this is what the scientists themselves are saying. In 2019, with the backing of NIAID, the National Institute of Health committed $3.7 million over 6 years for research that included some gain-of-function work. The program followed another $3.7 million 5-year project for collecting and studying bat coronaviruses, which ended in 2019, bringing the total to $7.4 million. And I just want to mention real quick, right there they mentioned NIAID, and I want to reiterate and emphasize NIAID, as I mentioned previously, is here it is, National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is the organization that Dr. Fauci is the director of. So his organization funded this coronavirus, this COVID-19. And he's been the director of that organization for 36 years, since 1984. And in my experience, anytime someone's been in a position that long, it's usually a red flag for corruption. The article continues, many scientists have criticized gain-of-function research, which involves manipulating viruses in the lab to explore their potential for infecting humans, because it creates a risk of starting a pandemic from accidental release. And again, I have to emphasize and reiterate, you can see here, based on this information, that they're going in a different direction than research that's for treatments or therapies. Anytime they're talking about gain-of-function research, and stuff like that, there's only one purpose, and that is to explore here. I'm just going to highlight what I just read there. Explore the potential for infecting humans. And that has nothing to do with treatment or therapy. SARS, which is a severe acute respiratory syndrome, CoV-2, the virus now causing a global pandemic, is believed to have originated in bats. U.S. intelligence, after originally asserting that the coronavirus had occurred naturally, conceded last month that the pandemic may have originated in a leak from the Wuhan lab. At this point, most scientists say it's possible, but not likely, that the pandemic virus was engineered or manipulated. And of course, that's what they're going to say when a lot of them are being paid to engineer it and work on it, and they're getting the funding. The article continues, Dr. Fauci did not respond to Newsweek's requests for comment. NIH responded with a statement that said in part, quote, most emerging human viruses come from wildlife, and these represent a significant threat to public health and biosecurity in the U.S. and globally, as demonstrated by the SARS epidemic of 2002-2003 and the current COVID-19 pandemic. Scientific research indicates that there is no evidence that suggests this virus was created in a laboratory, unquote. And I find that a heck of a statement for the National Institute of Health to make when this article explains how they funded the engineering of COVID-19. And then they're going to turn around and say that there's no evidence that it was made in a lab after they funded it. The NIH research consisted of two parts. The first part began in 2014 and involved surveillance of bat coronaviruses and had a budget of $3.7 million. The program, funded by Shizhang Li, a virologist at the Wuhan lab, and other researchers to investigate and catalog bat coronaviruses in the wild. This part of the project was completed in 2019. A second phase of the project, beginning that year, included additional surveillance work, but also gain-of-function research for the purpose of understanding how bat coronaviruses could mutate to attack humans. The project was run by EcoHealth Alliance, a nonprofit research group under the direction of President Peter Daszak, an expert on disease ecology. NIH canceled the project just this past Friday, April 24th, Politico reported. Daszak did not immediately respond to Newsweek requests for comment. The project proposal states, quote, we will use S protein sequence data, infectious clone technology, in vitro and in vivo infection experiments and analysis of receptor binding to test the hypothesis that percent divergence thresholds in S protein sequences predict spillover potential, unquote. In layman's terms, spillover potential refers to the ability of a virus to jump from animals to humans, which requires that the virus be able to attach to receptors in the cells of humans. SARS-CoV-2, for instance, is adept at binding to the ACE2 receptor in human lungs and other organs. So that sort of explains how they were using this bat protein and SARS-CoV-2 to explore and engineer it to be contagious and to be able to hurt humans. They knew what they were doing. According to Richard Ebright, an infectious disease expert at Rutgers University, the project description refers to experiments that would enhance the ability of bat coronavirus to infect human cells and laboratory animals using techniques of genetic engineering. In the wake of the pandemic, that is a noteworthy detail. Ebright, along with many other scientists, has been a vocal opponent of gain-of-function research because of the risk it presents of creating a pandemic through accidental release from a lab. So they were doing experiments to enhance the ability of bat coronavirus to infect human cells, and they were using techniques of genetic engineering. That's basically what the information just explained. And we've heard Richard Ebright mentioned as an opponent of this research repeatedly, and we know that he has opposed it Dr. Fauci is renowned for his work on the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 1990s. Born in Brooklyn, he graduated first in his class from the Cornell University Medical College in 1966. As head of NIAID since 1984, he has served as an advisor to every U.S. president since Ronald Reagan. And speaking of the HIV/AIDS crisis, scientist Dr. Judy Mikovits explained that she has a history with Dr. Fauci, and she had research that she did and developed breakthrough treatment for HIV, and her research was suppressed by Dr. Fauci, and she was fired for pushing her research in the form of therapy. He didn't want it to get out there. He had a financial interest in people remaining sick. A decade ago, during a controversy over gain-of-function research on bird flu viruses, Dr. Fauci played an important role in promoting the work. He argued that the research was worth the risk it entailed because it enables scientists to make preparations, such as investigating possible antiviral medications that could be useful if and when a pandemic occurred. The work in question was a type of gain-of-function research that involved taking wild viruses and passing them through live animals until they mutate into a form that could pose a pandemic threat. I mean, that's not funny, it's horrible. So he was purposely trying to create something that would work as a pandemic and mutate, it says right there, that would mutate into a form that could pose a pandemic threat. Scientists used it to take a virus that was poorly transmitted among humans and make it into one that was highly transmissible, a hallmark of pandemic virus. This work was done by infecting a series of ferrets, allowing the virus to mutate until a ferret that hadn't been deliberately infected contracted the disease. And I'm going to leave a link in the description for this article for anyone that wants to read it back. The work entailed risks that worried even seasoned researchers. More than 200 scientists called for the work to be halted. The problem, they said, was that it increased the likelihood that a pandemic would occur through a laboratory accident. So they're purposely creating a bioweapon. So it doesn't matter whether it came out and was released when they planned for it to be released, or if it was released early by accident. That's irrelevant. What matters is that they were making it in the first place, and every single scientist that was involved in creating it, especially Dr. Fauci, who oversaw the whole thing, should be arrested and put in jail. Minus the scientists who objected to it and opposed it. Of course, you know, they did the right thing. It says here, Dr. Fauci defended the work, determining the molecular Achilles heel of these viruses can allow scientists to identify novel antiviral drug targets that could be used to prevent infection in those at risk or to better treat those who become infected, wrote Fauci and two co-authors in the Washington Post on December 30th, 2011. Infected by what? The bioweapon that they created? I mean, that's ridiculous what he just said to defend this work. Fauci continued, quote, decades of experience tell us that disseminating information gained through biomedical research to legitimate scientists and health officials provides a critical foundation for generating appropriate countermeasures and ultimately protecting the public health. So basically what he's explaining is how to, that they're going to come create like a vaccine or some sort of treatment for the bioweapon that they're creating. It makes no sense. If you really look at what he's saying and you look at the whole thing, what Dr. Fauci used and said to defend what they were doing, it doesn't counterbalance. It doesn't justify it. It doesn't make any sense when he's talking about treatment or therapy or a vaccine to treat the very thing that they created, the bioweapon that they created. Nevertheless, in 2014, under pressure from the Obama administration, the National Institute of Health instituted a moratorium on the work, suspending 21 studies. 3 years later, though, in December 2017, the NIH ended the moratorium and the second phase of the NIAID project, which included the gain-of-function research, began. The NIH established a framework for determining how the research would go forward. Scientists have to get approval from a panel of experts who would decide whether the risks were justified. The reviews were indeed conducted, but in secret, for which the NIH has drawn criticism. In early 2019, after a reporter for Science magazine discovered that the NIH had approved 2 influenza research projects that used gain-of-function methods, scientists who oppose this kind of research heavily criticized the NIH in an editorial in the Washington Post. Quote, "We have serious doubts about whether these experiments should be conducted at all," unquote, wrote Tom Inglesby of Johns Hopkins University and Marc Lipsitch of Harvard. With deliberations kept behind closed doors, none of us will have the opportunity to understand how the government arrived at these decisions or to judge the rigor and integrity of that process. Unquote. Why isn't Trump going after the deep state FEMA drill gun control scam? Why isn't he defending the Second Amendment? And more recently, the First Amendment right to assemble has been violated and denied. And what has President Trump said? He's leaving it up to the individual states to make their own decisions, and some states have been abusing their power. And last, why is Trump ignoring deep state involvement in funding and engineering the COVID-19 bioweapon? And now he's promoting vaccines and saying it's all China's fault. So I continue to ask the question as we approach elections, is Trump fit to lead the United States as president?